Welcome back to project number 3 of this section. And this project is going to be the most exciting one, because now we will take everything that we learned in the first 2 projects to a whole new level and build a really cool and amazing game. And this is the game that I was talking about, and it's called the Pig game. Now this project here is really going to be a practice project. So a project where you and me will together reinforce all the skills that you have learned up until this point. Because remember from the last section, reinforcing knowledge is one of the most important things that you can do to learn, right? So in this project, I will do a little bit less explaining than before, at least about the stuff that we already learned, because we are really just practicing here, okay? Now, if you're in a hurry and just want to learn the basics, please feel free to skip this project. But of course, I would still really advise you to code along with me here. But now let's see how this game actually works. And in fact, you can try that along with me, because this time I hosted this demo on a live website. So you can access that by piggamev2.netlify.app. And the link is also in the README file of the repository for this course on github.com. But anyway, this is more of a real game now, because we actually have 2 players. So you can play this with a friend or something, or just against yourself. So the idea is that we roll a dice. And so now I'm player number 1. So this one is now the active player. So I roll a dice. And so you see that I rolled a 2. And so this number gets added to my current score down here. Okay, so this is my current score for the current round, and this here is my total score. And so let's see how that's going to work. So I can roll the dice again now if I want to. And now I rolled a 4, and that 4 got added to the 2 that I had previously. So now that's 6. And now I can choose to hold this score. So if I click this button, this score of the current round will get added to my total score, which right now is 0. And so when I hold, then my score will be 0 now, and we switched to player number 2. And now I can click roll dice again. So we rolled a 2, and I can hold again. And so now player 2 has 2 points. Now the thing here is that whenever we roll a 1, we lose all our current score, and it's then the next player's turn. And so that's why sometimes we need to hold our points. So let me show that to you. And oh, indeed, I rolled a 1 right away. And so now it's player 2 again. So let's keep rolling the dice. And I will now again wait for a 1 so that you can see that all my current score will be lost. So that's a lot of points already there. And now I rolled a 1, and the player lost all the points. Okay, so I could have held the points, and then I would have added all these points here to my score. So let's do that here. And again, a 1. And so, yeah, now here I hold, and I added them to these points. And I think by now you get how the game works, right? So the first player to reach 100 points then wins the game. But I will now not demonstrate that, because that's going to take too long. So we have these 2 buttons here, and then we also have, just like in the previous game, a way of resetting the game. So when I click here, as you might expect, this dice will disappear, and all the scores are set back to 0. And to understand this game a little bit better, for this application I designed something called a flowchart. So let's take a look at that. And this is what a flowchart looks like. So basically it's a representation of everything that can happen in the application. So on the left side we have in yellow the possible actions that the user can take. And then from there we see what happens in the application as one of these options is basically chosen. So as one of the actions is executed. So whenever the user rolls the dice, so clicks that roll dice button, then we need to generate a random dice roll. Then we display that dice roll, and then we check whether it is a 1. If it's not a 1, then add that dice roll to the current score, and of course display it. Right? So that is exactly the behavior that we saw when we tested out the game earlier, right? Now, if the dice roll is actually a 1, then simply switch the player. And so in this case, the dice roll will not get added to the current score. Next, the other option is that the user wants to hold his score, and then we add the current score to the total score. Once that is done, we must check if the score is above or equal 100. Because as I said, the player wins whenever the score is at least 100 points, right? And if it's not, then we just switch the player and the game keeps on running. Finally, when the user chooses to reset the game, we simply set all scores to 0 and set the player number 1 back to being the starting player. All right, so this is a very nice way, again, to visualize what happens in the application, and it's also a very good guide for us to actually implement the application in code. So usually, whenever I build a project like this one, I like to draw a flowchart like this. And it doesn't need to have all this precision right from the start, so we can just start out with a rough sketch without the complete plan of what we're going to build. But anyway, this is very helpful before we actually start writing code to have a good idea of what we will have to do. And if you want to build your own flowcharts that look like this, you can do so on diagrams.net. So that's where I designed this flowchart, and it's a very nice online drawing application that is completely free and really easy and fast to use. Okay, and so now, as always, let's open up our project folder. So I have the starter files here already, and now I need a new VS Code window. And then I just open the pick game. And this time, since the application needs this whole space, let's actually put it here on a separate desktop. And then as we test out, I will just move here from one desktop to the other. So let's make this bigger this time. And so, like always, we already have all our files here. So let's take a look at them. And JavaScript. So here, as always, just the use strict. Then here we have all the styles that we need for the application, and we will take a look at them as we go through the project. And then finally, the HTML file. Okay, and I also actually included the image of this flowchart here for you, so that you can maybe take a look at it yourself to make sure that you really understand how it works. Okay, so take a minute or two to maybe test the app again and check out this flowchart before we actually start. All right. Oh, also, I wanted to show you that I have one image here for each of the dices. So dice 1 looks like this, like 2 looks like this, and so on and so forth. So we have one image for each of the possible 6 numbers. So that's going to be important later. But now let's just start to write a little bit of code here. Let's get ourselves a new terminal here so that we can take a look at the application as it looks right now. And here I like to minimize it a little bit. Live server. Okay. And so this is our live version of the pick game. So again, we are here at this localhost at port 8080. And if you're seeing some other port, that's no problem at all, as long as it works. So maybe you still have something running on this port, maybe from the previous project, and then this project will run on another port. That doesn't really matter. So right now, in the starting point, this is what our application looks like. But of course, in the demo, we don't see the dice in the beginning, and we don't see any scores here. Okay? And so the first thing that we're going to do is to basically put these scores to 0 and make this dice disappear. And so that's going to be basically the starting condition here. So let's go back here to the code, and let me just show you where these initial values come from. So this is the 43 score that we just saw, and this is the 24. And so let's take a moment to inspect the code, because as you already know, we need the class names, and in this case also the IDs, to then identify and select the elements. So basically here we have one of these sections here for each of the players. And you see that the first one is player 0 and the second one is player 1. And I will explain you why the players are called 0 and 1 instead of 1 and 2, probably in the next lecture. So it will make sense by then, okay? But now about the scores, they are stored in this element and in this one here. And so you see both of them have the score class, but then each of them has a different ID. And so this time we need to select these two elements using their unique ID instead of a class name. So that's the ID of score -- 0 and score -- 1. So let's do that. So const score 1 and then document.querySelector. So this is the way that we learned it before. And now here we actually need the hash symbol. So score 0. So actually I'm interested in 0 here. Okay, and so again, now we used this hash because that is the selector for the ID. And the dot that we used to use is only for classes. Okay, now when we're selecting using an ID, then there's actually another way of selecting an element. And right now that's exactly what we're doing. So we're interested in IDs, not in classes. And so let me show you that other way of selecting elements that only works by ID. So let's call this one score 1. And then again, we use document, but then we're not calling query selector. Instead, we call get element by ID. And then here we just pass in the name of the ID. So just score 1. So without the hash here, because now we're not writing a selector, we are only passing in the name of the ID that we're looking for. Okay, so this works exactly the same as this, but the get element by ID is supposed to be a little bit faster than query selector. But I guess that's only relevant if you're selecting like thousands of elements at once. So usually I like to always use query selector, but I still wanted to show you that there also exists get element by ID. All right. And actually let's call these two here score 0 L, which stands for element, because you might then confuse maybe this variable here for simply the score value of player 0, right? And so in this case, we are making it really clear that this is a DOM element. So score 0 L. All right. Okay. So we're selecting these here, and now we can use the variables to do something on them. And again, we do that because probably we will need to do something with these selected elements multiple times throughout the application. And so we just define them once at the top of our file instead of having to select the same elements over and over again. So let's just add a comment here. And comments are also a good way of structuring the code and also of planning how we will build some features. So selecting elements. And so in this project, we will try to get a little bit more used to actually writing comments. All right. Anyway, let's now set these initial conditions of score 0 element. And then, as you know, we use text content, and then we set it to 0. All right. And now the same for score 1. Score 1 element dot text content to 0. And here we are specifying numbers, not strings, but JavaScript will then automatically convert them to strings to actually display them on the page. So if we go now to the application, that should already be in effect. And indeed, you see that now the scores are actually at 0. Great. Now all we have to do is to hide this dice here. And so let's do that using the technique that we learned in the previous project, which is basically creating a hidden class and then add that hidden class here at the beginning. Okay, So let's go to our style. And right now I don't have that class yet. So let's just create it. And I can close the terminal here. Let's just do that at the very end. So we create a class like this. And then we just set the display to none. So that's exactly the class that we had in the previous project as well. Okay, and so now we can just add that class to the dice at the beginning of the game. So that's easy enough. But first we need to select it. So let's call it dice L for the dice element. Let's check out what the ID or the class of it is. And here we see that it's actually just this dice class. So this image with this class of dice. So document.query selector dice. And so here we have the starting conditions. And now let's simply do dice element dot class list dot add, and now simply the string which contains the name of the class. And that's the hidden class. Give it a save. Let's check it out. And indeed, now the dice is gone. And let's see the HTML here actually. And now indeed, we have the hidden class here besides the dice class. Great. And then as we implement the roll dice functionality, of course, we will want the dice to be visible. And then we can simply remove that class again from the dice. Okay. And actually, that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video. In this video, we will actually start implementing our game's functionality. And we will start with the most important functionality, which is rolling the dice. And let's start with another look at our flowchart here. So that's why I included it in the starter files. So when the user rolls a dice, we want to first generate a random dice roll, then display it, and then check whether it is a 1 or not. And if it's not, we add that dice roll to the current score. And if it is a 1, we go to the next player. And maybe you're noticing that having or building a flowchart like this is pretty similar to actually dividing the big problem down into smaller sub-problems. So essentially, all these squares that we have here on the flowchart are like the sub-problems that we now need to go ahead and implement. So again, for a bigger application like this one, it's a very good idea to draw a flowchart like this, along with the process of solving problems that I taught you in the previous section. So use all of these methods that I showed you together whenever you need to solve a problem. Because in the end, building a project like this is also simply solving a problem. So you know how the project is supposed to work, but then the problem is to essentially implement it yourself. And so you need to divide that big problem that can seem very scary into smaller problems that will then be easy to implement. And as we move through this project, you will see that it's not so scary after all. And with that being said, let's now also see this part of the flowchart in action in the real application. So this is a little bit less abstract. So we roll the dice, and now we roll the 1. So let's just do it again. Let me reload the game as if it was a new game. So we roll the dice, we roll a number. So we generate a random number and then display the dice accordingly. And then we add that score down here. Again, and now we actually rolled a 1. And so we moved on to the next player. Okay. So that's what I just explained before using the flowchart, but seeing it in action is a bit easier. So we want to react to clicking that roll button. So we need to select that button element and then add an event listener or an event handler, right? So here we have or 3 buttons, and actually let's select all of them. So we will need them anyway later. So that's button new, button role, and button dash dash hold. So const button new is document dot query selector dot btn and then 2 dashes new. And now I will just duplicate this line here. So that's button roll, and here also roll, and then hold. So let's just confirm new roll and hold, and indeed new roll and hold. So that's going to work just fine. And now let's implement here the rolling dice functionality. So for that, we take the roll button. So that's button roll. And then, as always, when we want to react to an event, which in this case is going to be a click, we use the add event listener method. Then the name of the event, and then our handler function right here. And since we will not reuse this function, I can simply write it here directly. So let's now write some comments before we actually write the code, because that is very helpful in knowing what we should do. So we already know that we need to start by generating a random dice roll. Then we display the dice. And then we check for a rolled 1, basically. And if true, switch to next player. Okay, so that's exactly what we have in the flowchart as well. So let's start here. So let's create simply a dice variable. And so that's why now we have dice L here for the element, and then dice for the number itself. And this variable here needs to be not a global variable, so not a variable outside here, because each time that we roll the dice, we want to generate a new number. And so let's simply define that variable here. And now we create this random dice roll just as before. So math.random, which creates a number between 0 and 0.9999, so almost 1. Multiply that by 6. Then we truncate all of this. So we remove the decimal part. So that's math.trunc. So basically we pass in the result of all of this into this math.trunc function. And so this will then give us a number between 0 and 5. And so we just add 1 to elevate that to 1 to 6. So that's similar to what we did before. And now we just need to display this dice. Now the first thing that we need to do is to actually remove the hidden class. So remember, in the starting conditions, we hid the dice by adding the hidden class. And so now the first thing is to remove that. So dice element dot class list dot remove. So just like in the last project. And now comes the interesting part. So we know that the dice will be a number between 1 and 6, right? And now, according to these numbers, we want to display one of these images that we have here. So you see that we have dice -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so now we want to use this dice number here to, according to that number, display one of the images. And that's actually not hard to do. So let me show you how it looks like in the HTML now. So you see that right now, the source of the image is dice5.png. And if you know some HTML, you know that the source attribute here is how we define which image should be displayed. And we can now actually we can manipulate this source attribute from our JavaScript. And so that's the trick that we will use to display the image according to the rolled dice number. So let's again take the dice element, and then here there is a new thing. So now we can use the source property. So src, just like it is called in the HTML. And now we can set it to a string, and that string will then be the name of the image displayed. So let's use a template literal, and then we write dice dash, because that's basically the common name in all of these image names. And then here we use the dice number .png. And so with this, we can dynamically load one of these 6 images here, depending on the random rolled dice. So let's give it a save and let's give it a try, because this part should already be working now. So let's see. And indeed, we get this 3. Let's actually also log to the console for now this random number, just so we see that the dice is actually the corresponding one to the number. So let's go back here to the console, make it a bit smaller. And now let's roll the dice, and it works. Great. So we get a 2, and so indeed a 2 is also displayed here. Now 6 and 6 here. And let's just see if we get all the numbers. But yeah, we get the 1, and we already saw the 6 happening as well. So that means that our code is correct. Great. And now all that we have to do is to keep adding the rolled dice to the current score. Okay? And so that's what we will do here in this case, where we check for the rolled 1. So remember, that only happens when the number is not a 1, right? So again, if it's a 1, switch player. If no, then add the dice roll to the current score. So basically, let's test here if the dice is not 1. Because this is our main case, so the one that we're mostly interested in. And then our else block, which will be basically in case that dice is a 1. So let's just grab that here. So here we want to switch to the next player. But if it's not a 1, then we want to add the dice to the current score. So let's do this part here. And in order to actually be able to add the current dice to the current score, we need a way of saving that current score somewhere, right? So remember from the first project that we should not just store any data only in the DOM, right? So in this particular case, we should not only display this current score on the user interface. Instead, we also want a variable in our code which always holds the current score of this current round. Okay, so we need to define a variable for that. And where do you think we should do that? Well, it is certainly not in this function. So not in this handler function, because if we did that, then each time that we roll a dice, the current score would be resetted. So it would be redefined, because this function here is called over and over again each time that the button is clicked. So if we want to basically persist that value, so if it should keep existing, then it needs to be outside here in the main program. So let's call this one current score. And we start it at 0. And it needs to be a let because we will keep updating it. So again, this cannot be inside of this function, because then it would be set to 0 each time that we click the button, right? And so therefore it needs to be outside. Okay, and now we say current score is equal the current score plus the dice. And once again, there is a shortcut operator for repeating this variable here. So instead of this, we can just write current score plus equal the dice. Okay, so that's exactly the same, but it's a little bit faster to write. And now all we need to do is to display the score on the current player. Now at this point, we will just display it on player 1 to make it a little bit simpler, but in the future, we will need to keep track of which player is the active player. So that we will do in the next lecture. But again, for now, let's just display the score on player 1. So let's select the score or the current score for player 1. So let's check where that is scored. And it is right here with this ID --1 and --0. So let's actually copy that. And then I will select both of these elements up here. So let's do that below this one. And actually, I will keep using get element by ID now. So current 0, and then again element. Get element by ID, and then just the class name, again without the hash symbol there. And then current 1 element is document.get element, and then current 1. Okay, and so now let's use this one. So let me copy it. Dot text content equals, of course, the current score that we just defined previously. Okay, and let me just add a note here, change later, because in the future we will need to display this current score at the current player and not always at player number 0 or player number 1, right? But for now, we just want to make this functionality work. So let's just test it out for now. So roll dice 4, and you see that it added the 4 to the 0. And now 3 plus 4 is 7, and so it works. And now that we rolled a 1, nothing happened. So in this situation, we want to move to the next player. So basically switching the player. And so that's going to be this else branch. But this one I will leave for the next lecture because this involves doing a lot of stuff. So maybe you can think about what we need to do, because that would be a good opportunity for you to start thinking by yourself how to implement this kind of functionality. So try that out, and then let's move on to the next video. Let's keep building our pick game. And in this video, we're going to be concerned with switching from one active player to another one. So as we already know, whenever the player rolls a 1, we will enter this else block, right? So when the dice is not a 1, then the current dice gets added to the current score. But if we happen to roll a 1, then we lose all our score, and it is the next player's round. All right. So in the previous lecture, we implemented this functionality of adding the dice to the current score only as the player number 0. Okay. But now we need to make this work for both player number 0 and number 1. And so for that, we need to keep track of which player is actually the current player. And in order to do that, we actually need to keep track of which player is actually the active player in the moment that the dice was rolled. So basically, we need to know which player is right now playing. And with right now, I mean whenever the button is clicked. All right. So we will create another variable which will hold exactly that. So it will hold 0 if the current player is player 0, and it will hold 1 if the active player is player number 1. So let active player, and since we start with the first player, we set it to 0. Because remember that player number 1 is player 0, and player 2 is, here in our code, player number 1. And in fact, let me explain you right away why that is. So the reason is that we will store the scores of both players in an array. So let me do that here. So let, or actually const, because it's an array. So const scores equals an array, which will start with 0 points for both sides. And so these scores are actually the final scores. So the big scores which accumulate. Let me show that to you in the demo. So that's these big scores here. So these are the current scores, and these are, let's say, the total scores that keep accumulating, right? And so we are storing these two scores here in an array. And remember that the array is 0-based. And so the score of player number 1 will be here at position 0, and the score of player 2 will be at position 1. And so that's why it will be handy to have the active player variable here also set to 0 and 1. Okay, and we will see that in action actually in the next lecture, where we will hold the scores. But for now, knowing which is the active player is going to be important to actually display the current score here for the current player and not just always for player number 0. So instead of manipulating the element of player 0, so the current score of player 0, let's actually select the element dynamically. Okay, so let me show that to you. So we will actually now do the selection right here. Document dot, and actually let's use getElementById. And then here we need the class name. So the class name is going to be either current 0 for player 0 or current 1 for player 1. And so maybe now you start to see once more why we use the active player as 0 or 1. Because now we can use that variable to basically build these class names, okay? So when it's player 0, we will then end up with current -- 0. And if it's 1, we will end up with current -- 1, because that's going to be the active player. So what I just said is to do this. So current -- and then the number of the active player. Okay, and so now on this, we will get the text content and set it to the current score. Okay, so again, this one here will always set the text content on player number 0. But here we do instead select the score element dynamically based on which is the active player right now. Okay, so this is a very handy trick of building the ID name like this dynamically. Now here, when we switch the player, we of course will then need to change that value from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. So let's do that here. So essentially switching the next player means to change that value. So active player. And now here, let's now use again the ternary operator. So we can say if the active player is 0, then we want the new active player to be 1. And else it should be 0. All right. Does that make sense? So essentially we are reassigning the active player here. And we're checking whether right now it is player 0. So if it is, then here the result of this whole operator, so which again is all of this, then the result will be 1. And so then active player will be equal to 1. But if this is false here, so if the player is actually 1, well, then the active player will become 0. And so essentially this allows us to switch from 0 to 1. All right, so I think this should actually work already. So this is the demo, this is the real game. Let's just make sure that it works and reload it. And now as we roll the dice, remember that we are player number 0 right now. So this one. So 3, gets added to 0 is 3, then 7. So this works right now. 3. Let's wait for a 1 so that we can switch the player and see what happens then. Okay, so now we rolled a 1, and so now we should be player number 1. So essentially player 2. And so now when we roll the dice again, the new score should appear down here, right? Because this here is current 1. So this element here is the current 1 that we just defined previously. And indeed, it kind of works. So something happened here, but of course we need to reset the current score. So the current score was just for this player, but now we added that 4 to the current score of the previous round. So as we switch the player, we also need to reset the current score. Okay, so the logic of the active player is already working, but we still need to reset the current score. Also, you see that visually nothing changed yet. So in the real game, when the player is switched, this side here becomes white, and so the background kind of changes there. Oh, and another thing is that this current score here should also then be set back to 0 again. Okay, so basically the previous player should have its current score here visibly set to 0. So let me just show you what happens here when we switch to another player. So you see the current score, and now there's a 1, and so now this side here became white, and then of course the current of the other player became 0. So let's first take care of that logic of changing the values, and then I will show you how we change the background here. So let's go back, and the first thing that we need to do is to set the current score back to 0. So current score back to 0, and then we need to set the text content back to 0. Okay, so basically of the active player before we switch it. So for example, player 0 was playing, and then we switched to player 1, but before we do that switch, we need to change the current score of player 0 back to 0. So we need to do that here before we do the switch. Okay, so basically what we do is the same as this, but we simply set it to 0. Okay, so we're selecting the current player, which at this point is still 0, and then we set his text content to 0, and then we switch from 0 to 1. Okay, and actually we can also set the current score to 0 here, but that doesn't really matter because the current score is not bound to any player. So saving it, and let's try again. So all of this is still working, but let's wait what happens on the 1. So that's a lot of points here. Okay, so the current score is back to 0 here. And now watch what happens. And yeah, nice, that's working now. So now the actual current score variable was also set back to 0. And so 6 plus 0 now on player number 1 is 6. So as we keep doing that, it keeps adding here, and now we're back to player number 0. So this one. Oh, then I rolled another one right away, and so we switched to this player back again immediately. But you see that the logic here is already working. Now, the only thing that's left to do is that visual change. So putting that white background here on this other player. So let me show you in the HTML how that works. And so basically, the player that is active has this whole section here with the player -- active class. So you see that this first section, which is for player 0, right now has this class because player 0 is always the first player. But then as we switch to the other player, we want to remove that class from here and basically put it here on the other player. Okay, so let's do that. And as always, we will start by selecting these two players. And this time is actually a class. So player 0 class and player 1 class. So let's do that here and do that as the first. So const player 0 element document dot query selector. And now we need the dot for the class name. So that's player dash dash 1. And I'm just copying it here. I'm too lazy. And this one here is actually player 0. So 0 and 1 right here. And now let's actually change their class names. So the player active class. So down here. And for that, I will now show you yet another method that's available on the class list property. So we already saw, well, actually, let's start typing first. So player 0 element dot class list. And we already saw the remove method. We saw the add method, but now I will show you the toggle method. So we will use toggle now. And what toggle will do is that it will add the class if it is not there. And if it is there, it will remove it. Okay. So we could do that manually also by checking if the class is there and only removing it if it is. But using toggle takes that work away from us. So actually, we could have used this toggle method in the previous project of the pop-up, but back then I actually wanted to show you the contains method. Remember that? But now, again, we will use toggle here because it is easier. And so now we simply have to add this player active class, or actually to toggle it. So if we do that on both, then it will work. Because on player 0, it will remove the class if it's there, and if it's not, it will add it. And the same thing on the other player. And since we start with the player active class on only one element, so only on player 0 here, then toggling both at the same time will ensure that it's only ever on one of the elements at once. So let's now check that out. Just to make sure, reload it here. And let's wait for it. It's taking a lot of time. And yes, so we switched the active player and now it's also nicely visible. And yes, we changed it back as well. And so that works beautifully. Great job. And now, basically, the only thing that's missing to actually make this game work is to hold the current score. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video. And now let's implement the feature of a player holding the current score. And let's again look at our flowchart here. And once again, this flowchart basically represents the division of our big problem, which is to implement this game, into smaller problems, which are all of these green, basically, sub-problems here. Now, what we are going to implement is the functionality of holding the score. And remember, that happens whenever the user clicks on that button to hold the score. So when that happened, we want to add the current score to the total score, right? So let's see that in the demo version here. So I'm reloading here. And then as I roll the dice, let's roll it again. So I have 8 current points. And as I click hold, you see that these points will basically be transferred to my global score. So in this case, 0 plus 8 will then be 8. And then we change to the next player. And so that's exactly what we have here in the flowchart, followed by switching the player. Now, this switching of player only happens when the score is still below 100, because when the score is at least 100, then the current player wins. Okay, and so now let's implement basically this logic that we have here. Okay. So we want something to happen when the user clicks on this hold button. So button hold, right? So let's take that and add an event handler. So button hold dot add event a listener. Once more on the click, and then once more our function value here, the function that will be executed as the user clicks the button. And so let's again write some comments to say what we want to happen here. First, add current score to the score of the active player. So active player's score. And then check score is already at least 100. And if so, then basically finish the game. And if not, then switch to the next player. All right, so now we want to define the current player's score. And remember how I told you in the last lecture that to store the scores, we are using this scores variable. And this scores variable is this array, which at the same time holds the score of player 0 and player 1. So player 0 at position 0 and player 1 at position 1. And so now we can use the active player variable to get the correct score of the current player. So scores at position active player, so that's what I just explained, will be equal that score plus the current score. So we say plus equal the current score. So again, when it's player 1, then this will be scores 1. But when player is 0, then it will be scores 0. And then we take that value and add the current score to it and assign it again to scores at the current active player. So just to make it 100% clear, if player is currently 1, then this would be this. Okay? So scores at 1 is equal to scores at 1 plus the current score. So I'm just going to leave it here as a comment so that you really understand what's happening here. So we changed that score, and now we of course need to display it as well. And so now we will do it in a similar way to as we did up here, where we basically select it based on the active player. So document.get element by ID, and now let's just check out again the name of the element. So that's score 0 and score 1. So these are the IDs. And again, we will replace 0 or 1 here dynamically. So again, a template string, current, and then here, the active player. So when it's player 0, it will be current 0. And so that first score will be selected. And when it's player 1, well, then the other element will get selected. And then we can set the text content to the score of the active player. So scores, active player. Give it a save. And so now our game should almost be finished. We will be able to play it basically until infinity, but it should work. But actually, it would not yet work because we haven't yet switched to the next player here. So right now, as we hold the score, we are not switching. So we are not checking if the score is greater than 100, but we are also not switching. And so let's leave that checking if the score is 100. So basically checking if the player won the game. Let's leave that for the end. And for now, let's just switch to the next player, because usually that is what needs to happen. So switching to the next player is this code. So it's going to be the exact same thing. We still need to reset the current score to 0 here, both in our program and also on the user interface, which is what we do here. We need to switch the player from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, and we need to toggle the player active classes to show which player is the active one. So all of this code here, we will need it again down here. So should I just go ahead and copy it now? And I hope that you already know the answer for that. So that would violate the don't repeat yourself principle. And so what I'm going to do is to simply take this code and put it into a function. And then I will call that function in both the places where I need this code to execute. So I'm cutting the code now here. And then up here, I will create a function. So I'm going to call this one switch player equals a function. And this function does not need any argument at all, or any parameter, because the code is exactly the same in both situations. So usually when we are refactoring something, like we are essentially doing here, then there is many times like a small thing that changes in the code. And then it's very useful to have a parameter so that when we call the function, we can specify what changes. So that's what we did when we refactored some code in the first project. But here, nothing changes. All we want to do is to simply repeat this code. And so we don't need any parameters and we don't need to return anything. This is simply just a reusable piece of code. And so let's call that here. Switch player, call it here, and call it here. And again, we will then put this in the if-else statement later once we check for the score to check if the player has won. But now we just want to make the game work. And so, of course, after we hold the score, we need to switch to the next player. So exactly as it says here in our flowchart, except that we're now skipping for now this part. So we're going from add current score to total score directly to switch player. Okay, and so now we should be ready to test our own version here. So now I have 6, let's hold it, and okay, something went wrong here indeed, because our score is still at 0, and that should not be happening. So let's check it out. And let's start by adding a console.log here, just to see if we are actually catching this event. So if we are handling it correctly. So hold button. So as I mentioned in the previous section, we really use console.log all the time to debug any kind of situation. And I could have just erased this part of the video showing you just the final solution, but I think it's a good idea to show you the debugging process right here in the video as well. So let's play and let's hold. And so we got the hold button here. So something worked. And actually, yeah, also the background color changed sides here and the current score was erased. So we already knew actually that something was indeed happening, but let's now actually find out what is going on here. And so now I want to log this value. Okay, so I'm basically now logging the score of the active player, and let me actually do that after I assigned it. So after we changed it, I will want to take a look at it in the console. Maybe the only problem is that it's not showing up in the element, so as the text content. But maybe the score itself is correct, and then we can see it in the console. So let's play again, and we already changed the player. And now I hold, and indeed, here we get 9. So that's the score that we had before. Let me show that to you again and reload. So I roll the dice 3, now I have 8, and watch what happens in the console as I click hold. And so indeed, I get the value of 8, which means that the score is actually correctly calculated. Now I just need to fix the part where it is not displaying here in this element. So here I selected current. So let me see. Oh, and yeah, that is of course a problem. It needs to be score. So it's score 0 and score 1, not current 0 and current 1. So that was the mistake. So here it is score. And now we can get rid of this console.log. And actually also of the other one that we have with the dice roll. So just make the code a bit better. Now I can close it up, roll the dice, and now as I hold, that should appear there, the number 4. And yes, now it works. Great. So let's play here a little bit. So now we accumulated 13 points. So let's hold them to end up with 17. And indeed, that works. Now let's hold these 4. And so I think this game is really a lot of fun to play, especially if you try it with someone else, which I actually did a couple of times as I was preparing this game, and I can tell you that it's really fun. But now let's actually get to the final part of this lecture, which is to check if someone reached the final goal of 100 points. And so if that happens, the game is over and we should not be able to click any of the buttons anymore. And we also want to assign a special class to the winner player to make it really obvious that that player has won. Okay, so let's add that check now. And so that shouldn't be too hard. So if scores at active player, so remember that is always here the score of the player that is currently active. So if that is greater or equal than 100, then the player has won. So this is where we finish the game. So when we finish the game, we want to assign a player winner class. And let me show that to you here in the CSS. So yeah, it's this one, player winner, which has this darker background color. So let me copy that. Paste that here. And now let's then select actually the player. So document.query selector. And let's again take a look at the code here, just so we don't make any mistakes. And so the player is really a class, player dash dash, and then the number of the active player. So that is player dash dash and active player. And then onto this element, we want to take the class list and add this class name that we just copied from our CSS. And then we also want to remove the active player class. Okay, so where is that? Yeah, so when we switch the player, we turn on this player active, right? But now we then need to remove that because otherwise we will have the active player class at the same time as the player winner class. So let's fix that. But we simply need to select the same element again. And then here we remove player active. Okay, I hope that made sense. And now let's test it. And to make it a little bit faster, let's actually test it just with 20. Otherwise, it's going to take forever to reach that 100 points. All right. Well, and before we do that, let's now actually put this switching the player into the else block. Okay. So when the game finishes, we of course do not want to switch the player, but if it does not, only then we do switch the player. And remember that 20 points is enough to win. So let's roll the dice a couple of times. 11, so we're almost there. That was close with 16. And so now we should have enough. So if we hold now, then 10 plus 11 here is 21. So that's over 20. And so now this should then show us the winner player class. Well, that didn't really happen. That's weird. If I keep clicking here, then this number keeps getting added. Let me see in the HTML if the class wasn't added, but actually it was not. So we still have the active player and the winner class is nowhere to be found. So let's check that. Oh, and here we actually have the problem. So I did a mistake that I told you before not to make, which is when we use query selector, we need an actual selector. So here we are selecting a class, and so we're missing the dot here and here. So only when we get element by ID, then we do not specify the selector, we only specify the ID name itself. But when we use query selector, this needs to be a query. And so if we are selecting based on a class, we need the dot here. And so that should be fixed now. But this is great to show you that mistakes like this happen in development all the time. So if you do this yourself, then really don't beat yourself up, because that's just completely normal, as you're seeing here. I didn't plan these mistakes. Anyway, now we have 16 plus 5 is 21, so that should be enough to win the game. Now we really got this winner class here showing that player 1 won the game. So this is now red too, and yeah, the dark background here too. Now the problem is first that we're still showing the dice, so we want to get rid of that. But even worse is that we can still click on these buttons. We can actually still keep playing the game. So you see that everything works the same. And now this player also won. They also have 22 points. But we still can keep playing the game. So of course, that is not good. So that is the next thing that we need to solve. And let's think how we could solve this. And for me, I think the easiest solution is to create a variable that holds the state of the game. So if we are still playing or not. So this is going to be a state variable, which kind of tells us the condition of a system. And in this case, the condition will be, is the game playing or not? And so if the game is playing, then we can click these buttons and then everything will work as normally. But then as soon as the game is finished, we will say that the game is no longer playing. And then we can no longer click on these buttons. All right? I hope that sounds good to you. So let's implement it. And so what I will do here is say, let playing, and now this will be a Boolean value. And so we start with true. So in the beginning of the game, we are of course playing. And so playing is true. And then when we finish the game, we will set playing to false. So that's in this case. So finish the game. And the first thing that we're going to do is to set playing to false. Okay. Now this in itself will of course not yet do anything. So we only defined whether the game is playing or not, but none of our code is reacting to that. So remember that we only want to be able to click on these buttons once we are playing. And so let's define that. So let's go to the first button, which is the button roll. And so basically what we can do now is that all of this logic that we have here should only be executed if we are playing. All right, so that's simple enough. So let's just say if playing, then do all of this. So let's remove that from here and put it down here. And then as we save it, Prettier will take care of indenting all the code and put it nice and beautiful. Okay. Now, playing here is a Boolean variable, and so that's why we don't have to write any condition like this, for example, because again, playing itself is already a Boolean, so we don't need to check if true is equal to true. And so now when we click on this button while the game is no longer playing, then nothing will happen. And so that's the beauty and the goal of having this playing variable. And now let's simply do the same for this other button. Okay, so if playing, then do all of this. And again, I'm deleting it from here and simply writing it down here. Give it a save, and then it will be beautiful and back to normal. And so now, as soon as one player wins, we will finish the game and set playing to false. And so the next time we click on any of these buttons, then here playing will be false, and then none of this code will be executed. And the same here for this button for rolling the dice. So I hope you were able to follow that logic, and so maybe you can use this kind of logic in your own projects as well. And this is actually the reason why it's so cool to start building projects as games. Because in games, we need a lot of this type of logic. And so it's really fun to demonstrate all these different aspects that are quite common actually in programming. So a state variable like this playing here, is very usual in programming. And so you can start to get used to sometimes needing a variable like that. And now let's try it out again. And remember that we still can win the game at 20. And just to make sure, let's reload. And now as I roll the dice, so let's hold here. And let's see if we can do it in one run. Oh, and we can. So we are at 20. And now let me hold. And now I won the game here. And now let's see what happens when I click. And nothing happens. The same for hold. So these buttons, of course, like you can still click them, but nothing happens. All right, that's awesome. There's just one last thing to do, which is to get rid of this dice here. So let's go back one last time. And so that also happens here when we finish the game. So remember that we displayed the dice up here when we roll the button. And so let's just copy this and basically add this hidden class back on. So right here, for example. And so now instead of removing it, we just add it back. Okay, give it a save. And let's try to do it fast again. And yes, now we should win the game and the dice is gone. Awesome. So we are almost done here with this project. So our game works really great. All there's left to do now is to implement this new game button here. So we could of course play again by reloading the page, but it's always nice to have a button to simply reset the game. And so let's move on to the next video and do that to finish this project. Welcome to the last lecture of this project and of this section. And in this one, we're going to implement the functionality of resetting the game at any point in time. So what we're looking for when we click on this button here is to remove the winner class and to set all the scores of all the players here back to 0. So all the total scores, this, and all the current scores should also be put back to 0. So essentially, we need to set back all the initial conditions of the game. Now, we already did something similar to this in our first game, and so maybe this is a good opportunity to leave this as a challenge for you. And this one will be a little bit more difficult than the one in the Guess My Number project, but you can still try to do it. So what I want you to do is when we click on this button, as I just mentioned, reset all the initial conditions of the game. And it doesn't matter if your solution will be dramatically different from mine. Okay, I just want you to try and I want you to write code on your own. No matter if you actually achieve the goal in the end or not. That is not the point right now. So just pause the video here, please, and try to do at least part of this on your own. So hopefully you had a great time doing that. And so let's now go back together here and do it ourselves. So we need this button new. And so once more, we will add an event handler on there. So that's button new dot add event listener, waiting for a click, and then we want to execute whatever happens here. So as I said, we need to reset all the scores. So let's start with that. And I guess I already selected these up here. So that is score L0 and score 1L. Okay, so these two scores, we want to set them back to 0. Now, actually, we already did that here. So let's just copy it for now. Okay. Then we also need to set all the current scores back to 0. So that is current 0L and current 1L. So current 0L equal 0, and then current 1L also back to 0. Next up, we need to remove the winner class. So this dark class that we have here, and now it's going to disappear because as I move out from this window, it will save and then it will reload. So I'll only go half. But you see this dark class, the winner class, needs to disappear. And so let's do that. And so that should be player 0 element dot class list dot remove and player winner. Now, of course, we do not know which player won the game. And so we have to do this on both the player elements. Okay? And that's no problem at all. So we already know that only one of these two elements will have this class, but we can still tell JavaScript to remove a class even if it's not there. So JavaScript will happily do that. Then next up, we also need to remove the active classes on both players, because again, we do not know at this point which one is the active player. So let's just remove them too. Now we'll just copy it. So player winner here is both active. And then we also need to set the first player to be the active player. So let's do that. And in fact, let me just change the code here in this line, because there's no need to remove it from player 0. Because, well, player 0 should be the active player in the beginning. And so there's no need of removing it and then adding it back. So I will simply add it. All right. And if it was already there, then JavaScript will not add it again. Okay. So just like with removing, so if the class is not there, but we are still telling JavaScript to remove it, it will not give us an error. It will simply do nothing. And if we add a class that's already there, it will not add a second one. And so here, it's not a problem. So even if the class is already there, by saying add player active, we will not add another one. Okay. All right. And that's it for the visible part of the user interface. So we changed classes here and we manipulated the content. But of course, we also need to set our internal state variables back to the initial state. So basically what we need to do is to add these scores back to 0, set the current score back to 0, set the active player back to the first player, and also basically start the game again by setting playing back to true. So what should we do here? Should I simply take this code and copy it to the other function? And you already know the answer to this question, don't you? So of course not. Instead, we will create a function which contains this code together with the code that is already down here. Okay, and then we will create a new function with all of this. And I'm going to call this function init, which stands for initialization. So let me cut this code here and create this function here. So again, calling it init, which stands for initialization. And this is once again just a function that serves as a reusable piece of code. So we need no arguments here. Okay, so this is the init function, which will initialize our game. And now we also want this code in there as well. And in fact, we want all of this code. So all of the starting conditions should now be set here in this init function. So let's grab this and paste it here. Okay. And now these two are duplicate. So they're already down here. So this is the same as this and this. So let's remove it from here. And then let's move this one down a little bit. Okay. And again, I used Option or Alt arrow down to move the line like that. Give it some space here. And okay. So this is our initializing function. Now, when do we want this function here to be executed? We want it in two situations. So whenever we load the page for the very first time, or also when that button is clicked that we were just working on, right? So of course, we need the scores to be 0 at the beginning, together with the current score and the active player and all of that. And so we used to have this code outside of any function. And so it was executed right when the file was loaded. But now this code is inside of this function. And right now we are not calling this function here at any point. And so this code in here will not get executed as the page loads. Okay, so right now, as we load the page, you will see that it has these weird starting conditions that it had initially. So showing these random numbers and showing the dice. And nothing is going to work now if I click any of this. And so that's because our initial variables here are not set, because this function does not run on its own. And so, as you might guess, the solution to that is to simply run it. So as we now load this script, then JavaScript will find this function definition, and then it will find this line of code which runs the function. And so then, by that time, all of this code here will be executed, and then our game will work just fine. So let me show that to you. And so now we are back to looking normal, and our game should work. Oh, and actually nothing is working. So let's take a look at the console. But I can already guess what is happening. Okay. And so, yeah, we see here from these errors that these variables are not defined. Playing is not defined. And yeah, but it's not the only variable that is not defined. And so let me show you the error here. So this error comes from something that we already talked about very briefly before, but I didn't really go into yet. That's because in the next section, we will really get deep into something called scoping. Okay? But let me just explain to you right now that these variables that I defined here, they're only available inside of this init function. Okay? So again, this scores, this current score, this active player, and this playing, all of these variables, I declared them in here inside of this function. And so because of that, they are not accessible outside of the function. So we say that they are scoped to this init function, because this is where I declared them. And so the solution is to declare these variables outside of any function, but without any value. And so it's then in the init function where they will really be declared. Okay? And if that doesn't make 100% sense, it will make after the next section, where we will really understand deeply how scoping like this works. Anyway, let's now declare these 4 variables here outside. So I will use let now for all of them. So scores, and then remember, as we already did in the fundamental section, we can define a bunch of empty variables by using commas here. So current score, active player, and playing. So now these variables, they basically live outside here. And so what we do here then is to essentially reassign them a value. So we need to get rid of these lets here, because that would then create new variables here. But again, that's not what we want. We want the variables basically to live out here, and then in the init function, we only reassign their values. So that's very different. So declaring a variable is not the same as assigning them a value, okay? And so right now here, we only assign them a value, but they still live outside here. And that's why they are then accessible in every function everywhere. All right. And now just to finish, we also need to use this init function, of course, on the reload function. So on this event handler here. And so just like before, here we now do not declare this anonymous function, but instead we pass in the init function, which again is really just a value. And so it's perfectly okay to pass this value into this other function. And just keep in mind that we do not call this function here. It is JavaScript who will call the init function as soon as the user clicks on the new button. And so now everything will work just fine. So we get 5 down here. And let's hold it now. And indeed, we moved to the other side. And with this, we should win the game now. So let's see. Hold, and indeed. And now here comes the test to see if this button works. And indeed, it does. And we can restart the game just like this. This time, let's player 2 win the game here, just to see if it works there as well. So that's enough points. And indeed, it works. But what matters is now that as we click the new game button, everything is back to normal and player 1 is back to being the current player. All right, great. And with that, we actually finished the game, almost finished. Let's set the threshold here back to actually 100 points. So that is the limit here on which we want this game to finish. But with that, the game is ready and feature complete. And yeah, I hope you're happy with it. So congratulations, great job for making it to the end of this section. That's already a really great achievement. And I hope that you can see that you already learned a lot of new stuff here. And now you can go ahead and play this game with your friends, and you can tell them that actually you coded this by yourself. So the code you wrote on your computer is what made this program possible. It's what makes this really come to life, so to say. So how cool is that? And maybe even your friend will then become interested in programming and you can do this journey together. But anyway, with this, we now really finished the fundamentals part of this course. And once again, I really hope that you can see that you already learned a lot of new concepts here in this last couple of hours. So congratulations once again, and I see you in the next section, which is really important because there you're going to learn how JavaScript actually works behind the scenes.